The land had not wanted them from the beginning. That was how she thought of it sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind came low across the Nebraska grass and pressed against the cabin walls like something testing for weakness. The land had not wanted them, and yet here they were, 2 years into a claim that had nearly broken them twice, still standing, still trying. They had come to the Loup River country in the spring of 1874, young enough to believe that determination was the same thing as preparation. He was 26, a carpenter's son from Ohio who had learned to read soil the way his father had taught him to read grain. She was 23, the daughter of a school teacher who had given her books and practical sense in equal measure. They had filed on 160 acres of bottomland prairie, built a single-room sod house before the first frost, and told each other every evening that next year would be the turning year. Next year had come and gone. The summer of 1876 arrived dry and indifferent. The creek that fed their small kitchen garden slowed to a muddy ribbon by July, and the corn they had planted in the lower field stood pale and stunned in the heat. He walked the rows each morning with his hat pushed back and his jaw set in that particular way she recognized. Not despair, but something close to it. A man calculating what could still be saved. It was in that lower field, on a morning when the sky was white with heat and the meadowlarks had gone sensibly silent, that he nearly lost his boot. He had been walking the far edge of the corn rows, checking the soil with his heel the way his father had shown him, pressing down to feel how deep the dry layer went. At one particular spot, perhaps 40 yards from the creek bank, his foot sank. Not the soft give of loose earth, but a sudden hollow drop, as if the ground beneath had forgotten its obligation to be solid. He caught himself on one knee, swore quietly, and looked down. The earth had opened a hand-sized gap, rough-edged and dark. Cool air rose from it, cool air, in July, in Nebraska. He knelt there for a long moment, not moving, the way a man goes still when something doesn't fit the world he thinks he knows. Then he pressed his palm flat to the gap and felt it again. A steady, quiet breath rising from somewhere below, as cold as well water, as steady as a held promise. She was hanging a washed shirt on the fence line when she heard him call her name. The tone was not alarm, not injury. It was the tone she had learned to love most in 2 years of hard marriage. That particular note in his voice, when he had found something that might change everything. She let the shirt fall across the wire and walked toward him through the pale corn, shading her eyes against the white July sky. He was on his knees in the field, looking at the ground like it had just spoken to him. She crouched beside him without asking what it was. That was one of the things he had understood about her before he proposed. She didn't pepper a moment with questions when silence was the smarter tool. She simply knelt in the dirt, close enough that their shoulders touched, and pressed her own hand to the gap. Her eyes went still the way they did when she was concentrating hard on something she couldn't yet name. "Cold," she said. "Cold," he agreed. They looked at each other over that small, dark opening in the earth, and neither of them spoke for a while. Above them, the July heat pressed down without mercy, the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer and turned the creek into a silver thread. Yet from below came this impossible, steady coolness, rising like something breathing. He took the short-handled spade from his belt loop. He carried it the way other men carried a pocket knife always within reach, and tapped around the edges of the gap. The earth gave a hollow sound for nearly 2 feet in every direction. Not the soft thud of ordinary soil. Something else. Something that rang faintly, as if the ground were a door left slightly ajar. She sat back on her heels and looked at the corn around them. The stalks directly above this patch stood shorter than the rest, she noticed. Thinner. Not diseased, just different. As if they had spent their energy going sideways rather than up, reaching around something below them rather than through it. She had walked past this spot every day for a month and never seen it. Now she could not unsee it. "Those 3 rows," she said, pointing. "They've always been off." He looked where she pointed. He nodded slowly. "I thought the seed was bad. Maybe it wasn't the seed." He started to dig at the gap's edge with care, not haste, the way he had learned to do almost everything after the first brutal winter out here had punished every man who moved too fast. The soil came up in thin, crumbling layers, sandy near the surface, then darker, almost clay-like, and then, at barely 10 inches deep, something solid. He scraped at it with the spade's corner. Not stone, not root, planks. Old ones, gray with age, fitted tightly together and running in both directions farther than the small hole revealed. She reached down and knocked her knuckle against the wood. That same faint, hollow ring. "Someone built something," she said quietly. "Built it and left it," he said. "Or built it and buried it." He looked up at her, and she looked back at him across the open ground. The afternoon light caught the dust in the air between them, and everything was very still. Somewhere behind the barn, a meadowlark called twice and went silent. The cool air kept rising from the gap, patient and steady, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to finally notice. He set the spade against the corn row and reached for the larger digging bar he had left at the field's edge that morning. He worked the digging bar carefully, not wanting to drive it through whatever lay beneath. The iron tip found the edge of one plank, and he angled it just slightly, prying rather than forcing. The wood groaned, a low interior sound, like a door in a house long closed, but it held firm. Old timber, dried over years, had drawn tight against whatever frame supported it from below. She knelt beside him and brushed dirt away from the seam between planks with the flat of her hand. The fit was precise. Whoever had laid this had taken their time, had cared. She found the edge of one board running perpendicular to the others and traced it 18 inches before it met another seam at a right angle. A frame. An intentional frame. Not flooring abandoned mid-build and simply covered over. Something with a purpose and an outline. "There," she said, pointing to where 3 boards met in what appeared to be a corner. He repositioned the bar at that corner and leaned into it, slowly, steadily. This time the resistance was different. A slight flex, a hairline shift of one board lifting while the adjacent one remained. There was a gap at the corner no thicker than a finger, but the cool air came through it now in a thin, deliberate stream that he could feel on his wrist from 6 inches away. He stopped and looked at her. "That's not just cold ground," he said. "No," she agreed. "It never was." He set the bar down, and they both sat back on their heels for a moment in the long grass at the field's edge. The afternoon had begun its slow tilt toward evening, the light going amber over the ridge to the west, the shadows of the corn rows stretching eastward in uneven lines. She wiped her hands on her skirt and studied the corner where the boards met. "We need to clear more surface first," she said. "Find the full edge. Otherwise, we pull one board and lose the others into whatever's below." He nodded. That was the right instinct. He had learned, sometimes at cost, to trust it when she reasoned through a thing calmly. She had a way of seeing shape before he did. Not just in this, but in most things. He picked up the spade again and began scraping back the topsoil in careful, wide strokes, following the line she had traced, working outward from the corner. The boards revealed themselves slowly, the way a map does when you unfold it section by section in poor light. Each stroke of the spade showed more of the same tight-fitted timber, the same gray-brown color, the same workmanship. Deliberate, practiced, not desperate. Someone who knew what they were building. By the time the sun touched the ridge, they had uncovered a rectangle roughly 6 feet by 8, its edges clean and squared, its surface intact except for one board near the northern end that had warped slightly and drawn apart from its neighbor. He knelt at that gap and lowered his face near the opening. The air that met him was cool and faintly, unmistakably it smelled of water. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was already kneeling beside him, her skirt pressed against the damp earth, her face angled toward that thin gap in the boards. "Water," she said. It was not a question. "Underground, by the smell. Moving, maybe. Still water goes sour." He pressed his palm flat against the warped board and felt what he could only describe as the faintest breath. A slow, cool exhalation coming up from below, steady as a sleeping thing. She sat up straight and looked across the field, measuring in her quiet way. He had watched her do this 100 times, her eyes going distant, not vacant, but calculating, the way a woman does when she is running figures no one has written down. "The slope here," she said finally. "It runs down from the northwest. If there's a spring seam in that ridge behind the Mercer claim, it could travel underground a good half-mile before it finds somewhere to go." He had not thought of the ridge, but once she named it, he could feel the logic of it. The way water does not ask permission, but simply follows the earth's own tilt. Patient as anything, going where it was always going. They worked together then, both of them, choosing care over speed. He used the flat of the spade where he could, and his hands where he had to, lifting each board by its edge rather than its face, testing the give before committing weight. She positioned herself opposite him and took the far end of each plank as he raised it, holding steady so the timber would not twist and drop. The first board came free whole, the second as well. By the third, they had enough opening between them to see down. The light was flat and low that hour, slanting from the east in long, pale angles, and it reached only a few feet into the darkness below. But it reached enough. Below the boards was not merely a pit. There were walls, stone walls, not stacked loose but mortared with mud and clay and fitted with the same deliberate patience as the boards above. The walls went down perhaps 4 feet before they met a floor of packed gravel, and along the base of the north wall, catching what little light found its way down, was a seep, a thin, constant ribbon of water pushing between 2 flat stones and spreading into a shallow channel that had been cut purposefully into the gravel floor, running east along the wall before disappearing into the shadow. Someone had shaped that channel, had set those stones to guide the seep. had built walls around it and put a fitted roof above it and covered the roof with 6 inches of field earth so the grass would grow and the seasons would pass and no one would know. The thing existed unless they found the corner the way he had, by accident, by the blade of a spade going deeper than intended. She was very still beside him. He could hear her breathing. "They built a room for the cold," she said softly. "They built a room and the water came with it." He lowered himself into the opening. The gravel floor settled firm beneath his boots, and he stood with his shoulders nearly level with the field above, which gave the strange sensation of being swallowed by the earth while still belonging to it. The walls were close but not confining. A man could turn around. A man could work. She handed down the lantern, and he held it along the north wall, following the seep with the light. The channel was perhaps 2 inches wide and half as deep, worn smooth at the edges from years of slow water. It had not been chipped hastily. Whoever had cut it had taken care to angle it just slightly, enough that the water moved without standing. It ran east and then curved, deliberately curved, toward a shallow depression in the far corner where the gravel had been replaced with flat stone, fitted tight, forming something close to a basin. The basin was no larger than a washpot, but it held water clear enough that he could see the gravel beneath it. He crouched there for a long moment and said nothing. She had lowered herself in by then, steadying her skirt against the stone edge, and she stood beside him with her hand resting against the mortared wall. The air was noticeably cooler than the field above. Not cold, not like a cave, but the kind of cool that held steady. The same cool they found in the root cellar back home, only more reliable, more even. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and left it there. "Doesn't change down here," she said. "Even if the day runs hot, this won't." He turned slowly. The space was perhaps 9 feet along the north wall and 6 feet across. The fitted ceiling boards above them, the ones he'd nearly split with his spade, were laid across notched beams, and the beams were seated into the upper course of the stone wall with a care that was unmistakable. This had been someone's serious effort, not a shelter dug in haste, not a storm hole thrown together in a bad season. This was a decision. Someone had looked at this ground, found what was beneath it, and built around it with intention. She moved to the south wall and ran her fingers along the mortar. "It's held," she said quietly. "All this time, and it's held." He didn't know how long. The boards above showed no rot where they'd been covered by earth. Exposed at the edges where the gravel showed, they were darkened, but solid. 5 years. 10. Perhaps longer. There was no way to know who had put a spade to this ground before him, who had found the seep and understood what it offered, who had gone to the labor of cutting and fitting and mortaring, and then, for reasons he could not guess, had left it all behind. That question settled over him the same way the cool air settled, quietly, without weight, but present. She looked up at him from across the small space, lantern light touching her face. "We need to know how far it runs," she said. He agreed with her without saying so. He simply moved to the north wall and began feeling along it with both hands, pressing at the mortar lines, testing where the stone gave way to packed earth. The lantern threw long shadows behind them both as they worked quietly, the way people do when they have arrived somewhere that demands a certain respect. The north wall ran about 8 feet before it met a place where the stone gave out. not crumbled, stopped. A deliberate end to the masonry, and beyond it, the earth continued, darker and looser, held back not by stone but by a pair of rough-hewn timber planks set on edge, wedged into the soil at an angle. He pressed his palm flat against them. They were cool and slightly damp. Behind them he could feel air moving. He turned to look at her. She had already seen it. She came around the small channel and crouched beside him, holding the lantern forward. The timber planks were not framing, they were blocking. Something had been sealed off, or at least held back from easy entry. Not locked, not hidden with any great cunning, just discouraged. He worked the first plank loose with both hands, carefully, tilting it back against his knee. Soil sifted down from above where the plank's edge had been pressed. He set it aside on the stone floor. The second plank came easier. What was behind them was another passage, lower than the cellar itself, no more than 3 feet high, but wide enough for a person to move through on hands and knees. The air that came out was noticeably colder, not unpleasant, clean in fact, with a faint mineral edge to it, the kind of cold that comes from deep, still water nearby. She leaned in and held the lantern just inside the opening. The flame held steady. No bad air. That mattered. "The spring is in there," she said. He believed she was right. The seep they had seen along the floor had to be fed from somewhere behind that wall, trickling in through the stone and mortar at low pressure, finding the lowest point of the cellar floor by slow gravity. Whatever was beyond this passage was where it began. He looked at the opening and then at her. She was already reading the same question he was turning over. They had no way of knowing how far back it went. A few feet, and then solid rock. Or deeper, a true chamber, a carved-out space, something the builders had known about and made use of, then sealed away. He did not want to go into a hole in the earth that he did not understand the shape of. That was not caution, born of fear. It was the plain sensibility of a man who had learned to respect what he did not yet know. But they needed to know its shape. Without that, they could not plan around it, could not decide what it offered or what it cost. He sat back on his heels and looked at the lantern. "I'll need more light," he said. "And rope." She went to the wagon without being asked. He heard the wooden chest creak open, heard her sorting through what they had, and while she worked, he used the short-handled spade to clear more of the loose mortar dust from the bottom of the opening. The passage was roughly arched, formed by stones set in a careful curve, not something made in haste. Whoever built this knew masonry. They had taken time with it, fitted the stones with intention, and then concealed the whole thing behind the shelving as though sealing a letter no one else was meant to read. She came back with a length of hemp rope coiled over her shoulder and a second lantern, the one they kept filled for emergencies and rarely touched. She had lit it already. He felt something settle in him at the sight of that. Her thinking ahead, her not needing to be told the whole plan before she moved through her part of it. He knotted one end of the rope around the base of the timber post nearest the passage, pulling it twice to test the hold. Then he looped the other end around his waist, not tight enough to bind him, but close enough to matter. She held her end near the post, not gripping it anxiously, but standing steady, her weight back on her heels. He got down low and pushed the first lantern through the opening ahead of him. The light spread, and he followed it in. The passage was short, perhaps 4 feet of crawling before the ceiling lifted, and he could rise into a crouch, then nearly to full standing. He held the lantern out and turned slowly. The chamber beyond was not enormous, but it was real. Stone walls on three sides, the same rough-cut limestone he had seen in the cellar, but here the floor was damp and dark, and the air carried a smell like deep well water, clean and mineral and cold. Along the far wall the seep was visible, a thin black line of moisture running down the face of the stone from somewhere above, collecting at the base into a narrow channel cut deliberately into the floor, angled toward the passage and on into the main cellar. That channel had been carved by hand. He could see the chisel marks. He crouched and looked at the whole shape of the room. It was perhaps 10 feet across and 8 feet deep. The ceiling was uneven but solid. There were 2 shallow niches in the left wall, cut square and smooth, sized to hold crocks or jars. He sat with it for a moment. The cold was real. Deeper than the cellar, more constant. The kind of cold that did not shift with the season because the earth here was insulated by its own depth. He understood now what this room had been. Not a hiding place, not a refuge from danger. It was a working room, a cold room, built around a living seep, designed to hold what summer could not protect. It was practical and careful and deliberate, and whoever built it had understood something about this land that he was only beginning to learn. He brought her back to see it that same afternoon. She had to crouch lower than he did to pass through the narrow opening, and she made a small sound, not fear, something closer to wonder, when the cold air met her face. He held the lantern ahead of them both and let the room speak for itself. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, reading the walls the way she read a page, her fingers trailing across the cut stone. She found the seep herself without him pointing to it. She crouched and touched the thin line of moisture and then looked at the channel carved into the floor, following it with her eyes toward the passage. They planned this, she said quietly. Every inch of it. She stood and pressed her palm flat against the ceiling, testing its solidity. The stone didn't shift. It had held years already, maybe decades, and it had the feel of something that would hold decades more. She looked at the 2 niches in the left wall and measured them with her hands. Width, depth, height, the way she measured shelves before fitting jars to them. Crocks would fit, she said, the big ones. That's what I thought. She was quiet for a moment, and he watched her think. That was something he had learned about her. She did not speak until the thought was finished, and when it came out, it was usually more complete than anything he would have said in twice the time. The temperature down here, she said. Does it hold through August? I believe so. The seep suggests the water table is close, and the depth alone would slow any heat from above. We'd have to test it through a full season to be certain, but it would change everything, she said. He nodded slowly. The butter, the milk, the salt pork we lose every July. She looked at the channel again. If we cleared that properly, made sure it drains clean, we wouldn't be fighting. The seep, we'd be using it. That's what they did, he said, whoever they were. She turned toward the passage and then back to the room once more, as though she was memorizing it. He had seen that look before, when she was deciding something. Not just considering, but deciding. We should not tell anyone yet, she said. Not until we understand it fully ourselves. He agreed without hesitation. Not from secrecy or suspicion of their neighbors, They had good neighbors, but because this was theirs to learn first. Something had been left for them here, carefully and deliberately, by hands that were gone. The least they could do was take the time to understand it before they did anything to it. She moved toward the passage and paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder at the room one last time. The lantern light caught the moisture on the stone, and for a moment the whole wall seemed to breathe. They came back the next morning before the dew had lifted. She brought a short-handled spade and a coil of rope. He brought the lantern again, freshly filled, and a length of cedar plank he had pried from the pile behind the barn, weathered but solid. Neither of them had slept especially well, not from worry, but from the particular restlessness that comes when the mind keeps returning to something it has not yet finished thinking about. The passage was exactly as they had left it. That fact alone settled something in him. Part of him had half expected the whole thing to feel smaller in daylight, or ordinary, the way strange dreams do when morning arrives. But the cool air meeting them at the opening was real, and the smell of wet stone and clean earth was real, and the room beyond was real. She went in first this time. She moved along the drainage channel with the spade, clearing the fine silt that had accumulated in the lower portion near the wall. He held the lantern while she worked, and they spoke little, only the practical exchange of two people who have learned to read each other's movements. When she found the point where the channel narrowed into a fitted stone trough, she stopped and looked up at him. "Someone cut this," she said. "This wasn't a natural seam. Someone shaped it." He crouched beside her and ran his thumb along the edge of the trough. The stone had been worked, not roughly, but patiently. The cut was clean on one side, showing the mark of a chisel used with care. They spent the better part of the morning following the channel from its entry point near the spring to its exit at the far end of the room, where it disappeared beneath the foundation stones at the base of the east wall. He used the cedar plank to bridge a soft patch of ground near the channel, so she could work along the full length of it without sinking into the damp. It was the kind of small thing that passed between them without words. He saw what she needed before she asked for it. By mid-morning, they had cleared the debris and the channel ran freely, a thin but steady ribbon of water pulling cleanly through its stone bed and away through the wall. The seeping dampness they had always battled in the root cellar above, the mold on the burlap, the soft spots in the turnips by August, now had an explanation that was also a solution. She sat back on her heels and watched the water move. "They knew this land," she said, "better than we do yet." He set the lantern on the stone shelf and looked around the room again. The shelf, the alcoves, the fitted floor, the channel running clear now in the quiet. "Then we'd better keep learning," he said. The water ran on without hurry, the way it must have run for years before anyone had come to notice it. They came up out of the ground that evening with soil on their hands and something harder to name in their chests. The particular fullness that comes not from finishing a thing, but from understanding it at last. She set the lantern on the table and he poured water from the pitcher into the basin, and they washed side by side the way they had done every evening for 3 years without ever remarking on it. The window held the last of the day's light, a long gold strip across the floor. Outside, the prairie was going quiet the way it did in late summer, the wind settling, the grasses easing. He dried his hands and stood at the window for a moment. The field looked different to him now. not smaller, not larger, but deeper somehow, as though the ground had a second story he had not known to count. She came and stood beside him. "We should dig a proper stair," she said. "Stone set into the earth, something that doesn't shift in the freeze." I was thinking the same. And shelves along the north wall, wider ones. We could put up twice what we managed last winter. He nodded. Twice, and keep it cool through August. They stood there a little longer, not speaking, watching the light fade from gold to copper, to the pale gray that meant the stars were coming. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. At supper, she said they ought to write down what they had found, the dimensions of the rooms, the direction of the channel, the way the stone had been fitted without mortar, the alcoves cut at a height that suggested whoever built them had known what they were storing. There was knowledge in that place that deserved to be kept, she said, not just used, but recorded. He agreed. He got out the ledger they kept for land claims and expenses and turned to the back pages, still blank, and set it on the table between them. She picked up the pencil and he held the lantern close, and they worked through it together the way they worked through most things. Him recalling the measurements, her setting the words down, both of them stopping sometimes to correct each other gently, without frustration, because neither of them had the whole picture alone. When she closed the ledger, she pressed her palm flat against the cover for a moment, the way a person might rest a hand on something they intended to keep. "Whoever they were," she said, "they gave us more than they knew." He thought about that, about the fitted stone and the cut channel and the shelf worn smooth by someone else's lamp, about what it meant to leave something useful behind for people you would never meet. "Then we owe it forward," he said. She looked at him steadily, and he saw in her face what he always saw there: steadiness, certainty, the quiet willingness to build. The lantern burned low between them, and the prairie held them, and the spring ran on underground as it always had, faithful and unhurried, waiting to be found.